Welcome to this explainer, where we are unpacking a fundamental tectonic shift happening right across the globe. We're looking at how a completely new class of rising nations is radically reshaping global influence. If you've been paying any attention to international news lately, you've probably noticed that the old rules of the geopolitical game, well, they just don't seem to apply anymore. Today, we're going to explore exactly why that is. To really wrap our heads around the state of our world right now, consider one absolutely staggering number. $2.7 trillion. That is the record-breaking global military spending recorded in 2024. According to the Institute for Economics and Peace, geopolitical risks today actually exceed the levels we saw during the Cold War. I mean, this massive $2.7 trillion figure, it's a huge flashing warning sign that we've entered an era of intense global friction. The old international order is, quite simply, fracturing.
Okay, let's just quickly run through our agenda for today. We'll start by looking at this shifting global order in the Great Fragmentation. Then, we'll define a really crucial new geopolitical concept, strategic autonomy. After that, we'll dive into two fascinating case studies, Indonesia's economic leverage and Turkey's hard power pivot, before finally zooming out to see what this multipolar future actually means for all of us.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the Great Fragmentation. We are witnessing a massive structural shift happening right under our noses, and it starts with a decline of traditional power centers.
Think about it like this. Superpower geopolitical influence, meaning the US and China, has essentially plateaued since 2015. Neither one is really expanding their relative sphere of influence in this highly competitive environment. At the exact same time, traditional great powers, places like Germany and Japan, have seen their share of global GDP absolutely plummet. But while the heavyweights are stalling out, the number of middle powers navigating this fractured landscape has nearly doubled. We've gone from just 9 back in 1991 to 16 in 2024. The middle of the pack is surging forward.
But there's actually a really sharp divide within this group. On one hand, you have established middle powers, countries like Australia and Canada. They grew and locked in their status prior to 2008, mostly by aligning super closely with US and European economic and security systems. But on the other hand, we have a totally new cohort, the rising middle powers, like Indonesia and Turkey. Their rise happened post-2008, during an era of intense global rivalry, and they are carving out a completely independent path, growing through regional assertion and a strict refusal to just fall in line with traditional power blocks. Which brings us to Section 2, defining strategic autonomy. So how exactly are these rising nations playing the game so effectively? It all boils down to a concept called strategic autonomy. Basically, this is a foreign policy posture where a nation deliberately maintains ties with multiple competing rivals to maximize its own independent room for maneuver. Rather than strictly aligning with one superpower and becoming totally dependent, they refuse to choose sides. Instead, they balance their relationships, extracting economic and security benefits from competing superpowers all at once to maximize their own leverage. It's incredibly smart. And because they aren't tied down to one specific bloc, we're seeing these rising powers build massive, highly concentrated influence right in their own regional backyards, like Indonesia cementing its leadership within ASEAN. But at the same time, they're maintaining these critical, far-reaching global connections. They've essentially become the ultimate geopolitical connectors, making absolutely sure they are indispensable to both their immediate neighbors and the global superpowers. Let's bring this to life with our first case study in Section 3. We're going to look at Indonesia's economic leverage and see how this autonomy translates directly into global dominance. Indonesia's recent moves are honestly an absolute masterclass in economic statecraft. By aggressively banning the export of raw nickel ore, Indonesia effectively forced the rest of the world to build refineries locally, right inside their borders. And you know what? It worked perfectly. They went from having just 2 nickel smelters before 2014 to over a dozen by 2020. This bold move captured massive Chinese investment, somewhere between $30 and $65 billion. Thanks to this strategy, Indonesia now controls roughly half of all global nickel mine production. They turned themselves into an unavoidable choke point in the global electric vehicle supply chain. But what are they doing with all that newfound wealth? If you track Indonesia's military expenditure over the last decade, you'll see a massive upward spike. They are heavily reinvesting that immense economic gain directly into hard power. They're aggressively modernizing their military capabilities, and they've set a wildly ambitious goal, building a 274-ship blue water navy capable of extended operations across the Indo-Pacific by 2045. They are seriously backing up their economic weight with military muscle. Now, here's where strategic autonomy really shines. Indonesia executes a masterful hedging strategy. They maintain super deep economic closeness with China, who builds their nickel hubs, but they balance that with incredibly diverse security ties. I mean, they're buying arms and fighter jets from Russia and France, trading heavily with China, and running large-scale joint military exercises like Garuda Shield with the US and Japan. They rely on everyone, which brilliantly ensures they are dependent on no one. All right, let's pivot over to Section 4, Turkey's hard power pivot. This is a nation that has taken a distinctly different, far more militarized approach to achieving that exact same strategic autonomy. We are talking about a dramatic policy shift here. Back in the early 2000s, Turkey operated under a very cautious, zero problems with neighbors diplomatic doctrine. It was all about regional calm. But today, they have completely abandoned that old approach for an assertive regional intervention and hard power projection strategy. They are actively utilizing military force to secure their interests, even when it causes intense friction with traditional great powers. A huge part of this story comes down to Turkey's global drone exports. Their world-leading drone technology, particularly platforms like the Bayraktar TB2, has fundamentally altered modern battlefields in places like Libya and Azerbaijan. And by establishing deep defense and security ties across Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, they're actively exporting this advanced hard power globally. They aren't just sitting back watching conflicts unfold, they are directly supplying the tools that shape the outcomes. But they're not a one-trick pony. Their strategic toolkit is incredibly diverse. Diplomatically, they showed they can talk to all sides by brokering massive deals like the 2022 Black Sea Grain Initiative between Russia and Ukraine. Militarily, they've set up overseas bases in Somalia, Qatar, and Libya. Economically, they've dramatically shifted their trade toward Asia, exploding from $19 billion in 2002 to a staggering $220 billion by 2022. And navally, they're pushing the ambitious Blue Homeland Doctrine to assert vast maritime claims. Put it all together, and they've made themselves an indispensable global power broker. Which brings us to our final section, a multipolar future. What actually happens when you combine all these diverse tactics from rising powers on a global scale? Well, we're seeing two different core tactics leading to the exact same strategic outcome. Whether it's Indonesia wielding massive economic leverage by monopolizing the nickel supply chain to hedge superpower reliance, or Turkey utilizing hard power, drone exports, and overseas bases to force independent deal-making, both of these rising middle powers are successfully carving out their own unaligned spheres of influence. They aren't following the old script, they're writing their own rules. A recent analysis from the Institute for Economics and Peace summed it up perfectly. They noted that as influence spreads across more states, global governance becomes increasingly multipolar, meaning traditional superpowers can no longer just dictate terms in a vacuum. We are now dealing with a highly complex multipolar web where getting international consensus on critical issues, things like climate change, trade, or conflict resolution, is just much, much harder to reach. And that inevitably slows down our collective responses. So, as we navigate the rest of this decade, we are left with a pretty massive question. Will these powerful new middle powers choose to use their growing influence for competitive fragmentation, potentially pushing us into even deeper global chaos? Or will they use their totally unique leverage to forge a new era of inclusive multi-node cooperation? Because one thing is for sure, the keys to the international order are officially in their hands.